Last week, we restarted the Torah Portion reading in Jewish life. It's marked with a holiday called Simchat Torah at the end of Sukkot, where one unrolls the entire Torah scroll and then rolls it back to the beginning to start over again with in the beginning, Bereshit. The second Torah portion is the one that we'll be looking at today. It's the Torah portion called Noach, or Noah. Now, Torah portions don't necessarily have a name coming from the content of what they're about. Sometimes it's just a word in the first line or so of the Torah portion that gives it its title. In this case, however, this is a definitive name for the Torah portion because Noah is the predominant protagonist through most of this Torah portion. Although it does go beyond Noah into the echoes of Noah, the impact of Noah throughout the coming generations, as we'll see. This Torah portion is part of the early mythic history that was written by the Jewish people many centuries ago. Now, from a humanistic perspective, we don't think this was given by God to Moses on Sinai in its final form as an authoritative account of the creation of the universe and everything since. This is not history for us. It's mythology. But of course, mythology is an important way of expressing values, of defining concepts, and of expressing your understanding of how the world works and how it should be structured and who is in it. In other words, who all these peoples are and what do they have to do with me. As we'll see, one of the themes throughout this passage is people relating to each other and peoples, plural, relating to each other as well. Now, traditionally, a Torah portion is divided up into 7 aliyot, or 7 portions that are read by a different person going up to the bima. But thematically, looking at this more as literature, I've divided it into 5 sections that I want to explore and discuss tonight. And we'll have a short conversation after each of these sections. First, I want to go through and summarize what's in them, go through the text a little bit. You have the text on the screen in front of you to follow along, and I'll highlight some of the details in the Hebrew that might be missed in the English. And then we'll have a chance to discuss each of those 5 sections as we go through. So the first section is what I would call a question of morals. Now, the story of Noah actually begins a little bit before this Torah portion. Keep in mind that the breaks for Torah portions and the chapters and verses that you'll see in a Hebrew Bible were added many centuries later. Sometimes there's even a disagreement between the Hebrew counting of chapters and verses and the Christian, quote, Old Testament version of the chapters and verses. And this is another example where the story seems to have already started. If you go back a little bit earlier in chapter 6, you'll see that there's a whole discussion of God deciding that he regretted having made people and wants to wipe them out because of all the terrible things they're doing. But Noah found favor. And now we segue into the Torah portion proper, beginning with, this is the line, or these are the generations of Noach. Ele toldot Noach. And it's an interesting word for generations, toldot. If you know any Hebrew, the word yeled means child, or yulad, gave birth. So this is the connection of children to generations. Now, what's interesting in this line, this is the line of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his age. The Hebrew is Noach ish tzadik tamim haya bedorotav. He was righteous and he was innocent or blameless in his generation. Now, very few people are described this way. And the rabbis actually debate, what does it mean to be righteous in your generation, blameless in your generation? One rabbi suggests that Noah was so good that he would have been good in any generation, no matter when. But another rabbi says, when it says Noah was righteous in his generation, that simply means he was good compared to everybody else. They give an analogy where a vial of perfume will smell beautiful no matter where it is, but a vat of wine will only smell better than other things in a pit of garbage. So is Noah permanently good no matter what? He would have been a saint anywhere? Or is Noah simply better than everybody else? I mean, ultimately, they're trying to justify, why does God pick Noah? Why not pick not Noah or Noah's neighbor? Why this person? Well, the Torah says he was righteous in his generation, and the rabbis have to refine, what does that mean? Does it mean there was no one else good? Again, the first rabbi's perspective is that Noah might have been the best of all the good people, even if there were some lesser goods, where others said everyone was so bad that Noah was just less bad. And not impressive on an absolute scale, but only relative. And this is an interesting category of moral evaluation, after all. We can ask ourselves, am I a good person simply compared to what everybody else is? Or am I a good person regardless of context? That's an interesting challenge. Now here in verse 10, Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. The word ham in English, you'd think of the meat. That's not the case. In Hebrew, it's Ham with a ch, but in transliteration, that often gets left out. We'll hear more about those sons after we get off the ark. Now, the earth had become corrupt before God. The earth was filled with lawlessness. Interestingly enough, the word for lawlessness in the Hebrew is Hamas. Hamas sometimes is also translated as violence. But you might know the word Hamas as a Palestinian militant organization. So if you read this text without thinking, you might think that the world was filled with Hamas. Well, in this case, it means some kind of violence or lawlessness. Again, it's trying to justify the flood that's going to come. And when God saw how corrupt the earth was, for all flesh had corrupted its way on earth, and it doesn't say exactly what kind of corruption there was. This is, again, an opening, for rabbinic commentary to come in and explain exactly what does it mean to say all the flesh was corrupt. And so some highlight sexual improprieties, some highlight cruelty or abuse of animals or other kinds of details. If you saw the movie that came out 5-7 years ago, that was a re-envisioning of the Noah story, you see examples of this kind of corruption in the flesh, at least in the filmmaker's vision. So then God says to Noah, and notice the word for God here is Elohim. That will become important a little bit later. So Elohim, God says to Noah, I've decided to put an end to all flesh, for the earth is filled with lawlessness because of them. I'm going to destroy them and the earth. Notice it's the earth's animals because, of course, a flood does nothing to fish. If the fish told the flood story, it would be like paradise, right? Where they could go anywhere and eat everything. But from the land animals' perspective, it's a disaster. And all of the flesh is going to be destroyed with this flood. Noah is told to make himself an ark of gopher wood, which is a certain kind of wood. We don't even today know exactly what kind it is. You have an ark with different sections, cover it with pitch, which is their way of watertight sealing it. You make the length of the ark 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, its height 30 cubits. A cubit's about 1.5 feet. So this would be a fair-sized passenger ship today, and again, given the dimension of ships in the ancient world, this would have been quite a large vessel. Make an opening for daylight in the ark and terminate it within a cubit of the top. Again, don't let the water come in. Put an entrance to the ark on the side, make it with the bottom, second, and third decks. Okay, so you got a QE2 3-deck model. And then God says, this translation is interesting. The Hebrew literally says, V'ani hineni, and I behold me. So it's really like extra emphasis. So the translation of for my part feels to me a little weak, but you can haggle with translators all day long. I am going to bring the flood, the mabul, water upon the earth, to destroy all the flesh. And the Hebrew is l'shachet. If you think of a shoichet, a slaughterer, it's the same kind of root. I'm going to wipe out all basar, all meat, all flesh that is on the earth, everything with the ruach chaim, the spirit of life. Ironically, the ruach chaim, the breath of life, is exactly what God had blown into Adam at the beginning of creation in Genesis chapter 2. And now he's going to take it away from all these living things, mitachat hashamayim, from under the sun. Anything on the earth will die. But I will establish a brit, a covenant with you. And notice the word brit might sound a little familiar. If you said an Ashkenazi accent, it would be bris. In fact, the bris milah is one kind of a covenant, the covenant of circumcision, but there are other covenants promised in the Hebrew Bible, and this is one of the first covenants. I believe it's the first covenant that's offered, is to Noah. So here is my covenant with you. So in other words, trust me. You will enter the ark, you and your sons, your wife and your sons' wives, and of all that lives, of all flesh, take 2 of each into the ark to keep alive with you. Shnai mikol tavi el hateva. 2 of everything you bring to the ark. Zacharu nekeva, male and female. Again, the Bible is very gender binary, we should recall. From birds of every kind, cattle of every kind of creeping thing on earth, 2 of each will come to you to stay alive. So you have a male and a female of everything to preserve them. It's, the ants go marching 2 by 2. Well, that's the way to start. For your part, take of everything that is eaten and store it away to serve as food for you and then. And so also preserve all of the grains, all of the seeds, all of the plants that are good to eat. You need to save those too. We only think about the animals, but Noah has to not only be a zoologist, he also has to be a botanist and to preserve all the plants. And it says in verse 22, Noah did so just as God commanded him, so he did. Now, the first verse in chapter 7 sounds like we just started over. Then Yahweh, or the Hebrew God with his proper name, said to Noah, go into the ark with all your household, for you alone have I found righteous in this generation. Wait a minute. Didn't we just have that righteous in this generation thing at the beginning of the last chapter? And wasn't he already told to go in the ark? And now the command is different in verse 2. Of every pure animal you will take 7 pairs, males and their mates, and of every animal that is not pure, 2, a male and its mate. Of the birds of the sky also 7 pairs, male and female, to keep seed alive upon the earth. Now what is this tahor, this idea of ritual pure animal, and lo tahora, and not pure animal? Pure and impure, what does that mean? And why have 7 pairs? Why have extras of the pure animals? And same thing for the birds, which are considered to be pure. Well, this is a distinction that echoes of a different kind of a source and attention. And that is one that's focused on purity and impurity, one that's focused on the number 7, and that's focused on the idea that certain animals are treated differently from other animals. This is most likely coming from a priestly preoccupation or perhaps a dietary law preoccupation. After all, if you had 2 of every animal, 1 cow, 1 bull, and you get off the ark and you decide you want a steak, well, goodbye cattle, right? That's the end of the species. You need extras of the ones you're allowed to eat. You can have just 2 of the ones you can't eat because you're not going to kill them anyways. So this is again reflecting a different ideology and orientation from the 2 by 2 model. This is the 7 pairs of the clean ones and 1 pair of the unclean ones. For in 7 days' time, again the number 7, I will make it rain upon the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. It's never 39 days or 42 days. It's 40. Nice round number. If you want to know why, well, we've got 10 fingers and 10 toes, and you have the primordial couple of 2 people. That's 20 fingers and 20 toes, or 40. Magic number. I will blot out from the earth all that existed. And yet again, verse 5, and Noah did just as. But notice the God's name is different. Here it's Yahweh instead of Elohim. The Noah story is often presented as one of the core examples of a documentary hypothesis story, where you have multiple documents that might have been put together at a later time that show some of the themes where there's repetition between the stories, a different emphasis, a different kind of God behaviors, and different preoccupations. And this is one example where the name change of the God also reflects some changes in the story. Noah was 600 years old when the flood came, waters upon the earth. Noah with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives went into the ark because of the waters of the flood. Of the pure animals, the animals that are not pure, the birds and everything that creeps, 2 of each came into the ark as God had commanded Noah. And on the 7th day, the waters of the flood came upon the earth. So with that cliffhanger, we'll stop for a second, and I wanted to ask you for your moral evaluation. First of all, what's your moral rating of Noah in this story? Does he behave appropriately? Is there something he does or doesn't do that perhaps he should have done? Is it okay to just save yourself and your family and to hell with your neighbors? He doesn't say boo. At least Abraham argues with God a little bit. Larry?
Yeah, I was going to say, I don't have any expertise in this, but isn't the highest moral deed to bend your will to what God is asking in their mindset?
Well, okay, so from that perspective, from the obedience perspective, he's doing it exactly right. God says, make an ark. He says, okie dokie. And off he goes. But we might evaluate it differently.
Yeah.
We might say, why doesn't he say anything? Why doesn't he ask a question or, ask for a little bit bigger ark that can take a few more people? Think of the parallel in the movie Schindler's List, where at the end of the movie, when the character Oskar Schindler has been reformed and he's saving all these Jews and he wants to save more, and he gives away all his money to save all of them, and then at the end he realizes he could have sold a gold ring that he had or his Nazi pin, and he could have saved a couple more people, and he wanted to save more in his ark. Where Noah, as long as he gets his wife and his kids wives, then he doesn't say anything. So let's take a step back then. What about God's morality in this story? Well, the Bible is trying to claim that the people were really bad, right? We see that a few times. The earth is corrupt and people are bad and violence and so he's going to wipe out every single living thing.
Why do the animals have to suffer? The non-human animals have to suffer.
So one of the rabbinic explanations for that is that part of the immorality was bestiality between animals and people, and therefore the animals were guilty. So they deserved it. I mean, yes, it's a very good question. People sometimes present this as a fun story for kids because of all the animals, and you get these Noah's Ark toys and stuff. And occasionally you get a sensitive kid who'll say, what about the third giraffe? What did the third giraffe do that was so bad compared to the other two giraffes? Now, we could make the psychological argument that what God is doing here is very human. You start a project, and then it gets messed up, or you decide it's messed up along the way, and you take it, and you crumple it up, and you throw it away. Well, that's sort of what God is doing here. The things have gone astray. Forget it. I'm going to wipe the slate and start over again.
But as parents, we don't have that choice. There's that old joke about, my wife and I have decided that we don't want to have kids. We're telling them this evening. You are responsible for your creations. You are responsible for the world and the situation you create. And to merely say, oh, everyone's evil, it's all bad, I'm starting over, is an incredible ethical abdication.
Yeah, but aren't we, of course, as always, discussing things in circles? Shouldn't an omniscient God have known?
Well, gods are only sophisticated as the people writing about it.
Yeah.
So, yes, of course. Now, of course, you'll get the argument of free will, right? That if people are going to be judged, God has to give them space to act, appropriately or not, and therefore punishment is fair. But if you don't do that, then they're children like 2-year-olds. You don't punish your 2-year-old for making a mistake the way you'd punish your 12-year-old. They're of a different level. So the question is whether this is an age-appropriate punishment or not. Yeah, Carol.
Well, I was thinking that a being that has this much power shouldn't really be allowed to make these kinds of mistakes.
Well, that's an interesting question. Is God's flood itself a mistake? Because at the end of the story, he sort of, if he doesn't regret it, at least he says, I'll never do it again.
Yeah, if you have that much power, then I don't know if you can make someone not be able to make mistakes you're not allowed, because like a mistake, how can you say you're not allowed to do that? But like if God is like, I don't think if you're gonna have this much power, like no mistakes at all.
Another interesting parallel we can think about in our modern period is the fact that sometimes people and animals and plants pay the price of other beings' poor choices, right? I mean, you think about pollution, you think about even like pollution downwind, or downstream, where other people are suffering when they had nothing to do with the factory that was dumping the chemicals into the river. this is, a reality that sometimes consequences are felt beyond the people that should be justifiably castigated for it. So the idea that there are ripple effects and that human beings can have effects beyond their own species, that's a reality we live with today. Now, we wouldn't call this justice. We wouldn't say this is the act of a benevolent, omniscient God. But it is a reality in life that our deeds impact other species far beyond what we sometimes imagine they will. That metaphor of the ark and preserving and saving is used in a lot of environmental activism because it's part of the carryover lesson. All right, so we're going to go back to our Noah story and take a look at the flood story itself. And in this case, when we look through this part of the story, you'll see that it connects very deeply with other Near Eastern mythologies. It has a lot of parallels to them. I'll actually read a couple passages from some of them, and you'll see how similar they are. But this is also another example of the universal myth. James Campbell wrote a book on universal myths. There's other comparative literature and comparative religion stories, collections that do this describing of the basic archetype myths of humanity and how they get expressed in many cultures. And one of them that appears in many, many cultures is a flood story. Now, the fact that there's a flood story in many cultures does not prove that there was, in fact, a global flood. Where would you look to prove there was a global flood? Into something called geology, the study of rocks. Because when water hits rocks, it leaves a record. It grooves and makes holes and all kinds of other beautiful things you can see at the Grand Canyon or a number of other places around the world where water plus time have done amazing work with rocks. But it takes time, and it takes a lot of water. And if there had been a global flood, there would have been an entire layer of effect on the rock and silt laid down and all kinds of other effects that would be demonstrated in the geological record, and it simply isn't there on a global basis. Were there regional floods? Of course. There are annual floods in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley and in the Nile Delta. And there was even a massive flood around the Black Sea when the Mediterranean water broke through at what is today Istanbul and poured into the Black Sea. At one time, the Black Sea was a freshwater lake, and people were living around the sides of it. And then it went up by 20 miles, into the inland because the water came flooding in from the Mediterranean, and it was a massive flood that destroyed thousands of people. We have records of those settlements. We have archaeology has dug into them. There was an exhibit of gold from those settlements that was making the rounds of museums some years ago that was really fascinating. Well, floods are universal, and so are the stories about them. This is one version of a flood story, and it also is one that is pointed to by what are called young earth creationists who want to think the world is only 6,000 years old and there was in fact a global flood with Noah. The scientists would disagree. Okay, as we said, on the seventh day the waters of the flood came on the earth. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month, it's very precise, isn't it? On the 17th day of the month, on that day, all the fountains of the great deep burst apart, and the floodgates of the sky opened. So notice, the water's coming from two directions. Water from above and water from below. You might also remember from Genesis chapter 1, when God is creating the world, he separates water from water. The sky in Hebrew is called shamayim, like the water up there, and the water down below is just mayim, or water. But in this depiction of the universe, there's actually water from beneath, whether it's wells or sort of primordial deep that then it reemerges, and also rain from above that comes down. And this says the rain fell on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. Again, a nice round number. That same day, Noah and his sons went into the ark with his wife and their wives, those and all the beasts of every kind. They came into the ark, 2 of all of each flesh in which there was a breath of life. What? We just saw earlier in the same chapter, it said 7 pairs of the clean and 1 pair. Well, this is again a reflection of that two threads of story that have been woven together. And again, how would a rabbi harmonize it? Well, at least 2 of each were taken in. It just doesn't say at least here. Thus they entered, comprising male and female of all flesh, Yahweh, and literally the God himself does the closing. Yahweh is the God that breathes the breath of life. He seals the ark personally. It's a very involved, hands-on kind of God. The flood continued for 40 days on the earth. The waters increased and raised the ark, so it rose above the earth. The waters swelled and increased, and the ark drifted on the water. Higher than the highest mountains under the sky were covered. 15 cubits higher did the water swell as the mountain. So 15 cubits higher than the mountains. It's very high. All flesh that stirred on earth perished. Birds, cattle, beasts, all things that swarmed on the earth, and all humankind. Kol ha'adam, all of humanity. All in whose nostrils was the merest breath of life, all on dry land, metu, dead. All existence was blotted out. Only Noah was left, and those in the ark. And when the waters had swelled on the earth 150 days, notice in our translation there's a comma, and then it's a whole other chapter. I mean, you wouldn't do that in a novel these days, but this is the way, again, the chapter breaks don't always work out with our understanding of the verses. God remembered Noah and all the beasts. Now, he remembered? It's an interesting phrase there. The same thing happens with the Hebrews in slavery. God remembers their slavery. And you ask yourself, did he forget? Was he occupied? Was there something good on Netflix? What was the distraction here? Well, in here, remembered means he is now turning his attention back to them. He is now changing their story in a new direction. And so a wind blew across the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the floodgates of the sky stopped, so there was no more water coming from either direction. The waters receded. At the end of 150 days, the water diminished. So in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, so it's exactly 5 months, right? Remember, you had the 17th day of the 2nd month to the 17th day of the 7th month. That's 5 months of 29 or 30 days. That's 150 days. And the ark came to rest on the mountain of Ararat. People are still trying to find ruins of Noah's ark, by the way, somewhere up there. The waters went down till the 10th month, and on the 10th month, the tops of the mountains were visible. After 40 days, Noah sent out a raven to see if the waters had dried. And the raven actually never comes back. The raven kept flying to and fro until the waters dried up. So, oops, so much for the raven. Then he sent out the dove to see if the waters had receded. But the dove could not find a resting place, and so it came back to the ark. He waited another 7 days and again sent out the dove. And when he came back, the dove had in its bill an olive leaf. This is why the dove with the olive branch is a sign of peace even today. And Noah knew the waters had decreased. He waited another 7 days and sent out the dove. And the dove did not come back anymore, so we knew that things had gotten even drier. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, on the 1st of the month, the waters began to dry from the earth. How wonderful! The new year is marked by the beginning of things drying. By the way, in the Hebrew Bible, the 1st month is in the spring. That's when Passover takes place. So you can imagine the end of the winter, the end of the rainy season, things begin to dry up. Oh, let's make that the 1st month, and we'll connect it to the Noah story. Noah removed the covering of the ark. He saw the surface of the ground was drying, and the earth was dry in the 2nd month. In the 2nd month on the 27th day of that month. All right. So here you have a narrative of a flood story. And you've got nice round numbers, 150 days and 40 days. You've got the raven sent out, and you've got the dove sent out. Definitely classic motifs of literature. But they're also classic motifs of ancient Near Eastern literature, because there are other flood stories from the same region that actually predate the Noah story. And then one has to ask, did the writers of Noah know these other stories and adapt them? Or did the writers of Noah just independently come up with something that sounds so similar? So here's, for example, from the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh is seeking eternal life, and he finds a man who survived the flood, whose name is Utanapishtim. And Utanapishtim was actually told to take animals and put them into a boat. His was a round boat, I think, instead of a classical ark. And he survived the flood, and he still lives forever. And so here's what Utanapishtim says about the end of the flood. When the 7th day arrived, I set forth and set free a dove. The dove went forth but came back. There was no resting place for it, and she turned round. Then I sent forth and set free a swallow. The swallow went forth but came back. There was no resting place for it. Then I set forth and set free a raven. The raven went forth, and seeing the waters had diminished, he eats, circles, caws, but does not turn around. It ate, but did not return again. Sounds familiar. Different birds, different order, but same kind of result. And a similar description of the gods telling him to build an ark and to collect animals. It's not exactly the same. There are differences, but it's definitely real parallels. So let me ask you, why do you think a flood story would be such a universal story? Not just the reality that things flood, but what psychologically about the human experience makes us afraid of a flood or a huge flood?
Yeah, well, what I would say that, other cultures, they've probably experienced something like this anyway. So it's like something that they can relate to. And floods can be devastating with lots of destruction. So it's like just incorporated into their whole, culture.
And yes, and it's also sort of the prototypical natural disaster. And it helps to have an explanation for natural disasters, because maybe you can figure out a way to avoid them. If you appease the right God in the right way, then maybe you can avoid. You'll get a flood, but it doesn't have to be as bad as the classic one in story. Yes, Larry.
Also, something like a volcano or a hurricane, you could run away from the source of it. Whereas a flood is coming at you from all directions at once. It's kind of like a nightmare where you just can't get away.
Sure. I mean, how many people have drowning dreams, right?
Yeah. So it's much more terrifying than many other kinds of disasters.
Yep. I mean, water is the paradox. We need it to live, but too much kills us, right? And the wrong kind of water will kill you. That old line, water everywhere, not a drop to drink. If it's the wrong kind of water, then it'll do you in faster than no water at all. So water is this universal source of life, but also source of fear. We experience the fear of the unknown, the uncontrollable, and the reality of natural disaster and trying to find a way to avoid that. And this story is trying to give a justification for a flood. You were bad. And a way to survive a flood. Be good. So here's again where that moral message is trying to come through here. If you're good enough, you'll survive the flood. There's actually a fascinating poem written by a Holocaust survivor who wound up moving to Israel that describes a Noah arriving on the seashore and sort of walking around, but Noah as if he were a Holocaust survivor. And it's a really poignant image there because, Noah's the only one who survived of all the people that he knew, other than his close circle. And he feels like he's in a new world with nobody there anymore, just like the Holocaust survivor might have. And he might be asking, why me? Why did I get to survive? Just as many of those survivors would have done as well. So, remember when God said, I'll make a covenant with you? Did God ask Noah to do anything? Well, he had him take the animals on the ark. But did he ask anything of Noah in behavior or in attitude or in action or in limitation? Well, not yet. But here it comes. This is why you always have to read the full contract before you sign. So here is the continuation of the story with the covenant and some new rules for Noah. God spoke to Noah, saying, "Come out of the ark, together with your wife, your sons, and your sons' wives. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh with you, all the animals and birds and so on, and let them swarm on the earth, upru uruvu, and be fruitful and multiply." Or actually, ufru uruvu, as it's voweled here. Be fruitful and multiply, be fertile and increase on the earth. This is actually one of the first commandments that Adam got way back when, to be fruitful and fill the earth, which he did, and then God didn't like it, so he wiped them all out again. But guess what? We got to start over. And this is why it's sort of interesting. We think of, even in generic Hebrew, a human is a Ben Adam, a son of Adam, or a Bat Chava, a daughter of Eve. But we might as well be daughters and sons of Noah, because Noah is like the new Adam, right? It's him and his family and his progeny. So Noah and his wife, who is not named, by the way, we could consider them like an Adam and Eve. Why do we even bother with Adam and Eve? Because they're moot. after the flood. So they again get the commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Hopefully they do a better job than Adam and Eve did, because look what happened with their kids. So Noah came out together with his sons, his wife, and his sons' wives. Every animal, every creeping thing, every bird comes out of the ark by family. It even uses the word mishpachotehem, but with their families they came out. So does that mean that they were really fruitful and multiplied on the ark? After all, they were there for, quite a long period of time, 10 months worth. It's 300 days, and then it's the first day of the new year that it's dry. I mean, he's in there for a full year. There are plenty of animals whose gestational period is not over a year. Well, so maybe there are families already coming off. Then Noah built an altar to Yahweh, and here's again the pure animals. Taking of every pure animal and every pure bird, he offered burnt offerings on the altar. And so Yahweh smelled the pleasing odor, and Yahweh makes a promise. This is a covenant that's two ways. Yahweh says, "Never again will I doom the earth because of humankind, since the devisings of the human mind are evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living being as I have done." So why is he not going to destroy the earth? Because they stink. These people are just naturally rotten, and this is just who they are, and forget it. I'm not going to destroy I'm going to have to work with the raw material I have. You go to war with the army you have, said Donald Rumsfeld. So Yahweh is saying, I've got to build a world with the people I've got, and if this is who they are, then this is how we're going to manage them. So a question showed up in the chat, how do you deal with the issue of incest, because you've only got so many people around? Well, you know what? You had the same problem with Adam and Eve, right? First of all, they had no daughters, according to the story, although they later did. But again, if they have daughters and their sons have, genetics was not something that the authors were interested in. And keep in mind, this is like mythic origin story. It's not focused on genetics. It's not focused on laws of a later time period. This is the sort of origin narrative that has to end up with the reality we have today. And, sometimes it gets a little more generic than detailed, as we might want it, in our fact-based system. So long as the earth endures, it says, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night will not cease. In fact, notice in the Hebrew, you have those opposites of seed and harvest, cold and warmth, summer and winter, day and night. Lo yishbotu, using that word of Shabbat to stop. It will not cease from that routine and that rhythm. So that's God's covenant is no matter how bad people are, I won't destroy everything. That will continue. So now again, we get a commandment directly not just to the animals, but to Noah and his sons. They too should revu, be fruitful and multiply. Umilu et haaretz, and fill the earth, just as Adam received. The fear and dread of you will be upon all the beasts of the earth, everything with which the earth is astir, and all the fish of the sea. They are given to you into your hand, so you're allowed to eat them. Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat. As with the green grasses, I give you those. So there is an explicit permission for people to eat animals here. It's not as explicit in the Genesis story with Adam and Eve, but post-Noah, clearly people are allowed to eat meat. However, there is a limitation. But you will not eat the flesh with its lifeblood in it. Ach basar benafsho damo, so a flesh with the blood of its life in it, lo tochelu, you will not eat from that. This is the basis of a lot of the kosher practices of draining the blood from the animal, of salting the blood out of the meat, and otherwise avoiding eating blood. In fact, if you're baking in a kosher household, you'll always break an egg into a separate bowl to make sure there isn't a blood spot in the egg, which would ruin the whole batch. And you just break the egg in a separate bowl. As long as it's clean, then you can add it in. If it's got a blood spot, you discard it right away, because you're not allowed to eat the blood, as it says very clearly in the book of Genesis here, in the Noah story. In fact, these rules of being fruitful and multiply on the earth, listening to a God, obviously that's implicit in these, not eating flesh with its lifeblood in it. For your own lifeblood, I require a reckoning of every beast of humankind too. I require a reckoning, that is, you can't get away with killing people here. Shfoch dam ha'adam, he who spills the blood of a person, ba'adam damo yishafech, by a human being, his blood shall be shed. Ki b'tselem Elohim, in the image of God, asa et ha'adam, humanity was made. So this phrase of the image of God, the idea that we have a common ancestor, this is one of the positives taken out of whether it's the Adam story or the Noah story, the idea that we have a common ancestor, or that every human being is equal. As we'll see, this story is going to go from humanity to one group of humanity at the very end of this chapter and the beginning of the next Torah portion, which we'll be talking about next week. So you have these rules here of not eating an animal with flesh, and of having a reckoning, having some kind of system of judgment and punishment, and no murder is allowed. But you are allowed to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And now here we get the full details of this covenant. Ani hineni. Remember that phrase from early on? That was as ready as God was to punish the earth. Now that same phrase of I, behold me, now I am establishing Briti, my covenant with you, and to your offspring afterwards, and to every living thing with you that have come out of the ark. I will maintain my covenant with you. Never again will all flesh be cut off by... Wait a minute, didn't he already promise about no flesh? Well, again, this is that repetition of the story that reflects those different sources. But again, now it's a covenant that he's making, and he makes a sign of this covenant. This is the sign of the covenant that I give to you. I have set my keshet, my bow, in the clouds, and it serves as a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. What's the bow in the cloud that you see to let you know that the rain is over and that the world is not flooding? It's the rainbow, right? In fact, in modern Jewish life in America, Keshet is an organization designed to encourage LGBTQ inclusion in Jewish life because, of course, the symbol is the Keshet, is the rainbow. And so this is a sign between where God lives in the clouds and the people on the earth. You even see the rainbow sometimes, bridging from earth to the sky. And God says, when I bring clouds over the earth, the bow appears in the clouds. I remember my covenant between me and you and every living thing, so the waters will never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When I see the bows in the clouds, I will see it and I will remember the everlasting covenant. So, interesting question. Is this to re-announce to humanity that God is not going to destroy everyone? Or is this to remind God, oh yeah, don't turn off the tap, let's not flood them out this time because you remember what happened last time. And so this is the sign of the covenant that has been established between humanity and God. If you were Noah, what would you think of this covenant? I might be a little skeptical. I mean, after all, this God just wiped everything out. And he says, well, now I'm not going to do it again. And my sign is this rainbow that looks really pretty. Okay. Once bitten, twice shy. You might be a little cautious. But as we'll see, Noah actually isn't very cautious coming out of this experience, because the very next story is a story of corruption. So now we have the story of Noah's family. The sons of Noah who came out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Yafet. Ham avi Canaan. Ham is the father of Canaan. Now, if you were a Hebrew reader hearing this story, that would raise alarm bells for you. Because at the time the story was written, Canaan, the Canaanites, were the implacable enemies of the Hebrews. Ironically, they also shared a common ancestor with the Hebrews. Another word for the Canaanites were the Phoenicians, which is the name the Greeks gave them. They were a coastal people, where the Hebrews were in the highlands of the land of Israel. But they have a very similar language, a very similar material culture, even a similar pantheon, because the Canaanite pantheon included a sky god named El, like Elohim, and a thunder god named Yahweh, like that Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh name we saw for the Hebrew God. There's times when the Hebrews get along well with the Canaanites and intermarry with them, and there are times when they're separated, and the Canaanites are condemned. But the fact that Ham was identified as the father of Canaan is like foreshadowing. Ham's going to do something bad. Because when we're writing the story, we know the Canaanites stink. And if the Canaanites stink now, then they probably had a bad origin story too. They've been bastards forever. And so we'll see that Ham becomes one of the villains of the story. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these, the whole world branched out. So this is the point of origin for all humanity. Noah was a tiller of the soil, and he planted a karem, a vineyard. And what do you do when you plant a vineyard? You get wine. You get grapes, rather. And if you press those grapes into juice, and you ferment that juice into wine, what happens? Vayisht min hayayin, and he drank from the wine. Vayishaker, and he became shikker. He became drunk. And he uncovered himself within his tent. He fell down stinking naked drunk. This is right after God said, here's some rules and here's my covenant with you. And what does Noah do? He gets drunk and falls down naked. Ham, again, notice it's emphasizing that he's the father of Canaan, those bastards. Ham, the father of Canaan, saw his father's nakedness and told his two brothers outside, look, Dad's naked in the tent. But Shem and Yafet, notice what they do. They took a cloth, they placed it against their backs, and walking backward, they dropped the cloth on him. They covered their father's nakedness. Their faces turned the other way so they did not see their father's nakedness. So walking backward, they might have seen his feet looking down, and then they flip the blanket over and they cover his nakedness that way. When Noah woke up from his wine and learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Arur Canaan, Eved Avadim Yehyeh Le'echav. Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will he be to his brothers. Why is he so mad at his grandson? The son of Ham? Well, more likely than not, this was a phrase that was circulating. This was a saying the Hebrews had. Cursed be Canaan, let them be our slaves. And blessed be the God of Shem. Let Canaan be a slave to them. If the Hebrews are the Shemites, the Semites, then the Canaanites should be slaves to them. Let them rule, let the Hebrews rule, that is the descendants of Shem, as we'll see, and the Canaanites should be slaves to them. May God enlarge Yafet, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be a slave to both of them. So those two people, but also their descendants that they represent, should rule over Canaan, and Canaan should be a slave. Slave, slave. Servant, subordinate, low. Because they were bad from the beginning. Now Noah lived after the flood for 350 years. He made it to 950 years, and then he died. And then in in chapter 10, we get the genealogy, the bloodlines of Shem and Ham and Yafet. Again, the Toldot, the lines of children, the sons of Noah, and the sons that were born to them after the flood. Because remember, it was just them and their wives getting on the boat. So the descendants of Yafet are Gomer, Magog, Madai, Yavan, Tubal, Mesh. We don't necessarily know what these are today. These were most likely either places or peoples that were known to the writers of this story, and this is the sort of origin genealogy for them. Imagine a narrative of America that said there was Mr. America and his 50 sons, and they spread it over a continent, and then the sons had sons like Springfield and Decatur, and okay. So this is sort of a genealogy of geography. The descendants of Gomer are Ashkenaz. Oh, you might recognize Ashkenaz. Didn't mean Germany or Eastern Europe back then. And some other descendants of Yavan. These are all these sort of northern peoples. The descendants of Ham, remember, Ham is the cursed one. Who are the descendants of Ham? You have Cush, which is Ethiopia. You have Mitzrayim, you might recognize from Passover as Egypt. You have Put, which is Libya, which was actually a colony of the Canaanites, and Canaan itself. Now notice, this claims that Canaan is a descendant of Ham, part of the Hamite peoples, where the descendants of Shem are a totally different branch. But in fact, we know the Canaanites are Semitic. They have a Semitic language. And this is again describing all the different clans of the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Girgashites. These are people that the Hebrews will be in conflict with in later generations, again claiming conflict going back to the original Canaanites. Now, sons were also born to Shem, and the descendants of Shem were Elam, Ashur, Arpachshad, Lud, and Aram. Now, two of these names we know. Ashur are the Assyrians, and Aram are the Arameans, or you think of the word Aramaic. These are Semitic or Shemitic languages. Again, Canaan belongs here, but it's not there because of the politics involved. Ultimately, the line that's important is Eber, like Hebrew, right? Ivrim, Ever. Two sons are born to Ever, and it goes into more of their genealogy. These are the descendants of Shem, according to their clans. Again, now we're narrowing down, not just from all humanity, to Shem specifically as an important one. But now we have a question. There's all these peoples. Where are they living? And why is it, with all these different peoples, if they all had the same ancestors, why don't they all speak the same language? Aha! Here is a challenge that requires a solution. And the solution is to spread them out and to talk about all humanity, how it became diverse. So this is the story in chapter 11, the famous story of the Tower of Babel. It begins, everyone on earth had the same language and the same words. They migrated from the east, they found a valley and began to build there. And they said, let us make bricks and burn them hard. So they learned to build. And now they said, let us build a city and a tower with its top all the way Bashamayim, in the sky and the heavens, to make a name for ourselves, or else we'll be scattered all over the world. You see, cities began in Mesopotamia. And they began to build cities as protection for shrines, but also as protection for farmers who could run inside the walls to be safe. If someone were attacking, they wouldn't be exposed. The city was a safeguard to them, and it was a way of keeping them together. It was the centripetal force, the gravity in the middle that kept them close. And so the idea of building a tower there would in fact help to join them together, because they could all see the tower and the tower could communicate with them. And it doesn't sound so bad. Let's build a tower. Let's make a name for ourselves, or else we'll wind up all over the place. So Yahweh comes down to look at the city and the tower that humanity is building. And he says, if as one people with one language for everybody, this is what they do, then nothing they want to do will be out of their reach. They'll be building electric cars soon, and they'll be going to the moon. Let us then go down and confound their speech there, so they will not want to understand one another's speech. Thus Yahweh scattered them from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. All of a sudden, they would talk, and people wouldn't understand what the other person was saying. All their language was mixed up, and that is why it's called Babel, or Babylon. Again, it's an origin story for the name, because there Yahweh confounded the speech of the whole earth. He balal. So, Al-Ken Kara Shema, and that's why they call this name Bavel. Kisham balal Yahweh Sfat, because they're confused did Yahweh the languages of all the people. And he scattered them from there over the face of the earth. So this is an origin story for human language. And we know this isn't exactly how it happened. But we do know that human beings started as, this small clan coming out of Africa, but as they dispersed geographically, their languages dispersed too, and there are language families. We use the word family to refer to languages because you learned from your family. We call it a mother tongue because you learn it from your parent. So we have our own stories of how these languages came to be. This is the origin story to explain how humanity went from one humanity to many peoples. And so now we're going to zoom in. Now that we've gotten all of humanity off the ark, we've gotten lots of descendants, we've scattered them over the earth, now we can turn to a different kind of origin story. This is the line of Shem. Shem lived 500 years, begot sons and daughters. His son Arpachshad had Shelah, and Arpachshad lived 400 years, and Shelah lived 30 years. He begot Eber, we saw him before. And after Eber, he begot Peleg. And after the birth of Peleg, he lived for many years. When Peleg had 30 years, he had Reu, and Reu had Serug, and Serug had... don't let anyone tell you that the Bible's all interesting, okay? Some parts of it are not particularly fascinating. But here at the end is the important part. When Nahor had lived 29 years, he begot Terach. And notice the ages, by the way, are getting lesser and lesser, 207, 200, 119. It's finally coming down to a reasonable number. When Terach had lived 70 years, he begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran had Lot, and Haran died in the lifetime of his father Terach in his native land, Ur of the Chaldeans, Ur Kasdim. Now, this is one of the clues that we know this isn't written at the time it claims to be, because it's not called Ur of the Chaldeans for many centuries later. But here the key point is Abram, you might recognize that name, it will eventually become Abraham, takes a wife. His wife is Sarai, and Sarai is barren and has no child. And Terach takes his son Abram, and they leave Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in the south of the Mesopotamian Valley, one of the oldest cities in the world, Ur. In fact, if you hear the phrase like in the Ur form or the Ur model of something, it comes back to Ur, the original city. And they go north to the town of Haran, and they settle there. And Terach dies in Haran. And who's left in charge? His oldest son, Abram. And that's why this is the narrowing in from all of humanity to this particular tribe and this particular subset of this tribe to this person, Terach, and his son, Abram, who will become the protagonist of our story and the father of the Hebrew people. If this story begins with an origin narrative for why we are afraid of floods and why we have a rainbow and why we eat certain animals and don't eat other animals and why we have rules and why we don't eat the blood in animals, it's giving you origin stories for all these things and why we speak languages. Now the origin story is going to change. Instead of a universal origin, it's an origin for one family, which will become one people. And that's why their founding figure is called Exalted Father, also known as Avram. So we'll turn to the story of Avram next week when we learn about the origin myth of the Jewish people, not just of all people in humanity. Any last thoughts on our story of Noah and the flood before we wrap up our service tonight?
Yeah, I have a question. What about the animals in the ark? They had only 8 animals, like praying mantis or the lions and tigers. They survived for 150 days.
How did the kangaroos make it there? And the penguins? What about the climate? You know, there's mutually, inconsistent climate preferences here. Okay, again, it's like the incest question, right? You're asking practical questions of an origin story. And I remember an anecdote that was told about Sherwin Wine, one of our founding thinkers. When he was a child, he would ask his dad these kind of questions about the story, and his dad would respond, "The stories were not made for so many questions." That some of these questions are just not the kind of questions you ask of this kind of story.
You can go to Ohio to the museum, Al, and you can ask them. They'll have wonderful answers.
Yes, although I did read once at the Noah's Ark Museum in Kentucky, I think it is. It's like at the border. They had water damage from a particularly bad storm. But these are practical questions that we would ask with a scientific mindset. Of course, the get out of jail free card is always, it's a miracle. God wants it that way. Snap, snap, abracadabra, and there you go. Now, in the Noah movie that came out some years ago, Noah creates a kind of like incense cloud that makes them all go to sleep. And they just all hibernate for the whole time they're on the ark. And that's how they get around the question of how do they eat and how do they poop and how do they, all these other challenges. So, yes, there's all those kind of questions. That's a practical question being asked about a mythological story. And, you could ask similar kinds of practical questions about the Greek mythology. It doesn't work there either because it's not that kind of thinking. It's not that kind of storytelling. Now, where you do run into challenges sometimes is when people want to present these as fact. I mean, there are people called young earth creationists who want to prove the world is only 6,000 years old and prove there was a Noah's flood about 5,000 years ago. And they write books about this. And then they want to get those books sold in bookstores. They want to get these books sold in the Grand Canyon gift shop. And they want it to be sold in the science section of the Grand Canyon gift shop, when it should be in the literature section or the creative imagination section of the Grand Canyon bookstore. And so they sometimes get into arguments with the park rangers who are managing the bookstore over what section should you shelve these, Noah's flood books in. And, you could say, well, you think one thing, I think something else. I have evidence on my side, prove it. And so far, they have not proved it to any degree of scientific accuracy. So on that, we rest.
Well, of course, though, in like Texas, you have to teach creationism as part of, evolution.
No, that's not. They're not yet allowed to do that. There's been a lot of court cases about that, and now what often happens in school districts where there's controversy over this is the teachers just don't teach evolution, rather than teach evolution and deal with the crap they get for having taught it, or have to teach creationism in a science class. They just don't teach evolution. And they avoid the topic, which is its own problem. There's actually a wonderful national advocacy organization called the National Center for Science Education, which promotes the teaching of evolution in schools. And they've done that for 40, 50 years. And they really do wonderful work because this is an essential part of science. And it explains so much of biology, anthropology, and so much else of our understanding of the world. So they're pushing to do that. But unfortunately, if you read their reports, all too often you'll get school districts that just don't teach it because they want to avoid the controversy. And that's a loss too.